Welcome to Secrets in Slumber. Tonight, we travel together into a story that lives between silence and memory, between the steady rhythm of the sea and the quiet expanse of the sky. This is not a tale told to frighten, nor to startle. It is a story meant to soothe, to guide your thoughts gently, to give them wide horizons until they drift as easily as waves across the Pacific. You are safe here. The mystery will unfold softly, like pages turned by candlelight. We will linger with sailors keeping watch in darkened radar rooms. We will sit beside pilots who followed impossible movements in the sky, and we will listen to the echoes that memory carries long after the instruments fall silent. The Pacific remembers, and so tonight, will we let your breathing match the rhythm of the ocean, slow, steady, endless. Let your body grow lighter, as though it too were carried by tide and current. For in the space between heartbeats, mystery lives, and in that mystery, rest awaits. Now, let us begin. The ocean at night is a vast canvas of quiet motion. Waves rise and fall with the patience of centuries, their rhythm steady, their sound eternal. Above, the sky stretches unbroken, dotted with stars that seem close enough to touch, yet remain beyond reach. Between these two immensities, sea and sky, lies a space where mysteries drift, waiting for those who watch closely enough to notice. In November of 2004, the Nimitz Carrier Strike Group sailed these waters. On the surface, it was a time like many others. Sailors walked the decks, their boots clicking softly against steel. The air smelled of salt, oil, and faint jet fuel. Radar operators sat in darkened rooms, studying glowing circles of green light. Pilots prepared for training exercises, helmets in hand, checklists running silently through their minds. The routines of the Navy unfolded as they always had, steady and precise. Yet in that steady rhythm, the unexpected appeared. On radar screens, blips came and went, sudden, fast, untraceable. On the ocean's surface, disturbances appeared in calm patches of water. In the skies above, shapes hovered and darted, moving with a grace beyond the aircraft that guarded those seas. It was here that the now famous FLIR1 footage would be captured, a small oblong object, featureless and white, darting across the thermal vision of a jet's camera. To the casual eye, it was nothing more than a blur of light on a grainy screen, but to those who understood what they were seeing, it was presence without explanation. The Pacific remembers, the radar remembered, and the camera remembered too. This story is not told to resolve the mystery. It is not told to prove or disprove. It is told to guide you gently into the quiet, where memory and wonder meet. The voices of sailors, pilots, and analysts blend into a lullaby of testimony, steady and calm. You may listen to every word, tracing the details as carefully as the radar traced its arcs, or you may drift away, letting the rhythm of the ocean and the calm cadence of this tale carry you into sleep. There will be no jolts. There will be no sudden alarms, only the soft unfolding of a story that has lingered for years, quiet yet enduring. The Pacific remembers, the silence lingers, and the mystery waits. Now, let us step aboard the carrier, feel the cool wind across the deck, hear the steady hum of machinery, and enter the watch of those who first saw what should not have been there. The story begins. Chapter 1. The Pacific Watch. The Pacific has a way of swallowing time. Days at sea blend together, waves repeating their rise and fall in patient succession, each one indistinguishable from the last. For those stationed aboard a carrier strike group, the ocean becomes both companion and cage. It stretches without end, horizons circling in every direction, a reminder of isolation as much as of vastness. In November of 2004, the USS Nimitz moved steadily across this expanse. Her decks gleamed under the cool breath of salt air, the scent of jet fuel and oil carried in every gust. Life aboard was routine, but it was routine built on intensity. Thousands of sailors and aviators lived in a city of steel, every moment structured by schedules that never paused. From above, the ship appeared small against the immensity of water, but up close it was alive. Engines humming, catapults steaming, the clang of tools echoing from hangars. In the mess, trays clattered and voices mingled. In the berths, narrow bunks carried tired bodies. On the flight deck, crews in colored jerseys guided aircraft with glowing wands, their movements precise against the thunder of engines. For the pilots, mornings began with ritual. Flight suits pulled tight, helmets checked and sealed, oxygen systems tested, masks hissing softly. Each step was performed with care, not only for safety, but to center the mind before leaving the solidity of the deck for the shifting freedom of the sky. The sea itself seemed to welcome them and mock them at the same time. Its surface glittered under sun, endless and calm yet capable of swallowing any trace of what passed above. Sailors leaned on rails during breaks, watching the waves roll out to meet the horizon, knowing how quickly something could disappear into that expanse. The rhythm of life on a carrier was constant, bells marking the hours, engines roaring through launches, the metallic groan of steel under stress. Yet within the hum of machinery and the monotony of routine, something else stirred. In a room deep inside the USS Princeton, escorting the carrier through those November days, operators sat before glowing radar screens. The air was cool, maintained to keep equipment steady. The light was dim, a steady green glow painting faces with quiet intensity. Each sweep of the FLIR1 radar traced arcs across the screen, recording the invisible sky. For hours, the returns showed only the expected training flights, occasional commercial aircraft far off their course, the flicker of atmospheric clutter. But then faintly something new appeared. A blip, too high, too fast, too sudden. The operator leaned forward, narrowing his eyes, fingers brushed controls, refining the beam. The return steadied sharp against the background noise. It hovered, dropped, then vanished. Seconds later it reappeared, miles away, moving in ways no aircraft should. He called softly to his supervisor, voice calm but edged with focus. A second screen confirmed the contact. Another operator leaned in, adjusting gain. The return remained impossible to ignore. The Pacific remembers. For those on deck above, the horizon still looked empty, the waves carrying only light. A sailor joked with a friend, his laughter cut by wind. Another pointed at a faint spark in the sky, dismissing it as a star. But when the light darted sideways, his words faltered. Both fell silent, eyes fixed, until the spark was gone. Down below, the radar swept on. Each pass was a heartbeat, each return a pulse of the unknown. The operators logged carefully, words stripped of emotion, unidentified aerial contact, altitude variable, speed inconsistent. And still the ship moved forward, steel cutting through water, unaware that the first threads of a mystery had already been woven into the fabric of its days. The Pacific remembers, the silence lingers, and the horizon was no longer empty. Night aboard a carrier strike group carried its own atmosphere. The roar of jets softened as sorties ended, the deck lights dimmed to preserve sailors' night vision, and the ship seemed to inhale a deeper rhythm. Corridors grew quieter, footsteps echoing sharply against steel floors. In berthing areas, the shift from chatter to snores marked the passage of hours. But the sea itself did not sleep. Waves pressed against the hull, steady and patient, their sound a low murmur in every compartment. Above, the stars spread in unbroken brilliance. Out here, far from cities, the Milky Way was a ribbon of light, stretching across blackness like a bridge to the impossible. For the radar operators of the Princeton, the late watches, midnight to dawn, were often the most difficult. Fatigue crept in, eyelids heavy in the dim glow of consoles, coffee cooled in paper cups, its sharp scent filling the room. Yet their work required precision, for errors in identification could ripple outward, shaping decisions made miles away. It was during these long nights that the anomalies appeared most often. At first, a faint return at impossible altitude, 80,000 feet, a place reserved for satellites, not aircraft. The contact lingered, then plunged, not in the arc of descent that gravity demanded, but in a near straight drop. In less than a minute, it hovered just above the surface of the sea. The operators leaned forward, trading brief remarks through headsets. Contact locked, copy, confirmed. The blip held steady, just above the waves. Then, without warning, it darted sideways. Miles vanished in seconds. The cursor scrambled to follow. The system reacquired, locked again, and then, as quickly as it had appeared, the return vanished altogether. The Pacific remembers. Minutes passed. The operators rubbed tired eyes, checked calibrations, ran diagnostics to ensure the system was sound. Everything checked clean. Then another contact emerged, this one miles away, steady at altitude. A sweep later, it plummeted again, repeating the impossible dance. They logged the events with careful neutrality. Unidentified aerial contact, altitude 80,000 feet, descending to 200 feet in 60 seconds. Lateral acceleration, inconsistent with known aircraft. Each entry was precise, unemotional, but their eyes told another story. Behind professionalism was awe, a quiet weight that settled in the room with every return. In the silence between reports, the operators felt the presence of something beyond them. The steady hum of machinery only emphasized the contrast. Machines behaved predictably. The objects did not. One young operator whispered, after a contact vanished, "It's like it knows we're watching." His supervisor shot him a look, but said nothing. Others glanced at each other, their silence agreement enough. On the decks above, sailors leaned on rails, jackets zipped against the cold Pacific wind. Some watched the stars, tracing constellations to pass the time. Others lit cigarettes, their embers glowing faintly against the darkness. A few noticed lights that shifted strangely, darting when stars should not, hovering when aircraft could not. They rarely spoke of it, but they remembered. Inside the radar room, the sweeps continued. Each rotation of the scope felt like a heartbeat, each return a pulse. Operators rotated out for rest, replaced by fresh eyes, who quickly found themselves staring at the same impossible blips. The night stretched on. The ship moved steadily through dark waters, engines thrumming deep in the hull. Routine carried on above and below, but within the radar room, the ordinary was already broken. By dawn, when the first gold light spread across the horizon, the anomalies had appeared a dozen times. They had dropped, hovered, vanished, reappeared. The logs were thick with entries. The operators rubbed their faces, tired but alert, their unease tucked into the formality of written words. The Pacific remembers. The silence lingers, and the question grew heavier. What else was sharing their skies? Morning broke gently over the Pacific. The horizon blushed pale gold before the sun lifted free of the sea, light spilling across steel decks and mirrored waves. The Nimitz stirred fully awake. Crew moved briskly along corridors, boots ringing against metal. The scent of coffee and eggs drifted through the mess, mingling with the briny air drawn in through ventilation ducts. Above, the flight deck came alive with movement. Crewmen in bright jerseys guided aircraft into position, arms sweeping with practiced precision. Steam hissed from catapults. Oil-slick rainbows shimmered on the steel surface, and the roar of engines deepened as jets warmed for the day's flights. It looked like routine, but beneath routine, unease lingered. Down in the radar room of the Princeton, operators ended their shifts with bleary eyes. They logged final entries, each one neutral on the page, but weighted in memory. Unidentified aerial contact, variable speed, reappeared miles from last track. Their words would travel upward, stripped of speculation, but those who had watched the blips vanish and reappear carried something that could not be filed away. That morning, the logs reached the officers responsible for the day's briefings. Meetings were held in windowless rooms, lit by fluorescent light. Charts lined the walls, and a faint odor of coffee and paper hung in the air. One officer read the reports carefully, lips pressed thin. He had seen unusual contacts before, always explained later. Atmospheric reflections, faulty returns, even experimental tests. Yet this pattern unsettled him. Too frequent, too consistent, too sharp. "Prepare the pilots," he said quietly. And so, as aviators filed into the ready room, helmets in hand, the anomaly entered their world. The room buzzed with low conversation as they settled into chairs. Some leaned back casually, arms folded, while others flipped through checklists or scrawled notes on pads. The air was cool, conditioned to fight the heat of machinery, yet tension threaded through it, subtle but present. At the front, an officer cleared his throat and began. His tone was even, almost clinical, but his words carried weight. Radar has detected multiple unidentified aerial contacts over the past several days. Altitude shifts from 80,000 feet to near sea level in under a minute. Movements inconsistent with known aircraft. No transponders, no correlated flights. The room grew still. The officer continued. Contacts reappear miles from previous positions. No consistent pattern, but behavior suggests controlled flight. You are to maintain normal training operations. If visual contact occurs, report immediately. Do not engage. Silence followed. Pilots exchanged glances. Some raised eyebrows, others smirked faintly, dismissing the notion as radar error. Yet the absence of laughter told another story. Even the skeptics knew the difference between a single glitch and a repeated pattern. David Fravor, a seasoned commander with thousands of flight hours, leaned forward slightly, listening intently. He knew radar operators. He trusted their discipline. If they were logging anomalies night after night, there was something to it. His instincts told him this was not clutter, it was presence. The Pacific remembers. After the briefing, chatter resumed in low tones. A few pilots joked half-heartedly, muttering about ghosts on the scope. Others remained quiet, thoughtful. Fravor spoke little, but the thought lingered in his mind as he strapped into his jet later that morning. Routine exercises awaited, but routine now carried a shadow. On deck, the sea stretched endless and calm. The horizon looked unchanged, but those who had listened to the briefing felt its weight. Somewhere out there, above the waves and beneath the stars, something moved that was not theirs. The Pacific remembers, the silence lingers, and soon the sky would answer. Chapter 2. Eyes on the unknown. The Pacific at night seemed endless. Stars spilled across the blackness in shimmering rivers, so many that the sky appeared more alive than the sea. From the flight deck of the Nimitz, sailors paused to look upward during rare breaks, their eyes drawn to constellations that city skies could never reveal. The sound of waves against the hull mingled with the faint hiss of wind. To live in that silence was to feel small, suspended between two vast unknowns, the ocean below and the heavens above. Deep inside the USS Princeton, that silence took a different shape. In the radar room, the air was cool and still, machines humming softly, screens glowing with steady arcs of green light. Operators leaned forward in their chairs, headsets pressed close, their eyes scanning circles that told them more about the sky than their own eyes could ever see. The rhythm was steady, almost hypnotic. Each sweep of the radar was a heartbeat, each return a breath. For hours the screens painted familiar patterns, training flights, climbing and turning, the distant tracks of commercial aircraft, the flicker of clutter erased by filters. Predictable, comforting in its familiarity. Then the anomalies came. A faint return appeared at impossible altitude, 80,000 feet, higher than any known aircraft in the area. It lingered for a sweep, then plunged downward, not the arc of descent a jet would carve, but a near vertical drop, ending near sea level in less than a minute. The operators exchanged sharp glances, their voices calm but edged with focus. Contact acquired. Copy. Descending rapidly, the blip hovered just above the waves, then it darted laterally, crossing miles in seconds. The cursor struggled to follow, the system locking briefly before losing it again. Seconds later, the contact reappeared far from where it had vanished. The Pacific remembers. The room grew quieter, each operator aware of the weight and the silence. They had seen glitches before, atmospheric effects that flickered and vanished. This was not a glitch. It was coherent, deliberate. They logged the event carefully. Unidentified aerial contact, altitude 80,000 feet to 200 feet in 60 seconds. Lateral movement inconsistent with known aircraft. The words on paper carried no awe, no disbelief. They were plain, professional, but inside, the operators felt the strangeness settle in their chests. As the watch stretched on, the pattern repeated. New blips appeared, dropped, vanished, reappeared, sometimes one at a time, sometimes several, always moving with speed and precision that exceeded anything cataloged. Coffee cooled in forgotten cups. Operators rubbed their eyes, fatigue mixing with adrenaline. A few muttered to themselves, running diagnostics, checking systems again and again. The equipment was sound. The returns were real. In the early hours, when most of the ship slept, the radar room felt like the only place awake to the presence of the unknown. Outside, the ocean rolled dark and silent, indifferent to what moved above it. Inside, the screens told a story no one wished to hear, but no one could deny. One operator whispered, not into the headset, but to the man beside him, "It's like they're playing with us." His colleague said nothing, but the look in his eyes was answer enough. The Pacific remembers. The silence lingers. By dawn, the anomalies faded. The radar screens returned to their familiar rhythm of commercial routes and training flights. Operators rotated off duty, filing their reports with weary hands. The words were plain, stripped of speculation, but the memory of what they had seen stayed with them as they lay in bunks, listening to the ship's hum and the wash of waves. Above, the sky brightened, golden light spilling across the horizon. Jets prepared for launch. Crews moved briskly across the deck, and the strike group carried on with its daily life. But beneath the routine, the mystery waited, patient and persistent, certain to return with the night. The Pacific remembers, and the story was only beginning. By the second week of November, the anomalies were no longer surprises. They had become a rhythm of their own, appearing on scopes almost nightly, repeating the same impossible maneuvers. The operators of the Princeton began to expect them, to anticipate the sudden blip at the edge of the screen, the plummet from impossible heights, the hovering presence that clung to the surface of the sea. Routine should have made it easier. Instead, it made the weight heavier. Every contact demanded a report. Each report demanded precision. In the Navy, language was not decoration. It was duty. To write carelessly was to risk misunderstanding, and misunderstanding could ripple upward into flawed decisions. So the operators stripped their words to the essentials: unidentified aerial contact, altitude shift 80,000 feet to sea level, 60 seconds, lateral acceleration, inconsistent with known aircraft, no speculation, no fear, no wonder. Yet behind the neutral words, their hands sometimes trembled. Behind the clipped voices, their hearts sometimes raced. They were trained to handle stress, but stress had always come with explanation: a malfunction to fix, an aircraft to identify, an order to follow. This was different. This was mystery, wearing the shape of data. The Pacific remembers. Supervisors reviewed the logs with composed expressions, but even they could not disguise the glances they exchanged. To have one unexplained contact was rare, but not unheard of. To have dozens repeating was something else entirely. It was persistence, not error, and persistence meant presence. The operators spoke little outside the radar room, but in the quiet of corridors or over coffee, words slipped out. One muttered to a colleague, "They move like they're alive." Another whispered, "What if it's something we're not supposed to see?" Their voices dropped lower, wary of ridicule, wary of disbelief. On deck, sailors told their own stories in hushed tones. A few claimed to have seen lights darting across the night sky, moving in ways no jet could. Some laughed it off, others fell silent, eyes fixed on the horizon. The tension lay not in fear, but in the burden of knowing. To file a report was to put your name to something that might never be explained. Cares had been tarnished before by whispers of UFOs. To be associated with the extraordinary was to risk credibility, reputation, even promotion, and yet the duty remained. They filed the reports anyway. The silence lingered. Late one night, an operator leaned back from his console, rubbing his temples as another contact vanished from the scope. "It's going to follow me into sleep," he said softly. His partner on the watch gave a faint nod, eyes still on the screen. They both knew that once seen, such things could not be unseen. In the space between heartbeats, wonder pressed against professionalism. The Pacific remembers, and so the logs thickened, stacks of neatly written observations, each one carrying the echo of the same impossible pattern. Taken together, they painted a picture too strange to dismiss, too consistent to ignore. Still, the reports went upward in silence, tucked into folders, passed along without commentary. Officers briefed them in calm voices, stripping away the awe, offering pilots the data as though it were simply another variable in an endless sea of information. Yet within the radar room, the weight remained. The operators carried it in their eyes, in their silence, in the knowledge that their words, neutral and spare, were all that stood between disbelief and acknowledgement. The Pacific remembers, the silence lingers, and the burden of testimony had only just begun. The sea was calm that morning, the Pacific stretching wide and silver under a pale sun. To those walking the carrier's decks, it felt like another ordinary day in November. Drills to run, aircraft to launch, maintenance checks to perform. Yet in the radar rooms of the Princeton, the ordinary had already broken. The anomalies had returned in force through the night, tracked and logged with the same eerie consistency. The operators filed their reports with weary precision. Supervisors reviewed them, brows tightening, voices subdued. By now, the pattern was undeniable. Dozens of separate contacts, each showing the same signature: high-altitude descent to sea level in under a minute, hovering without plume, vanishing then reappearing miles away. The Pacific remembers. The data moved upward, passed to officers who met in small rooms, thick with the smell of coffee and paper. Maps of the training area lay spread across tables, red markers noting the locations of anomalies. Pins tapped against notepads. Faces remained calm, but silence filled the spaces between words. "What if it's atmospheric?" one officer asked, though his voice carried little conviction. "Atmospheric doesn't hold steady at 200 feet, another replied, "and it doesn't reappear in a predicted waypoint." A pause followed. Someone drummed fingers lightly against the table. The weight of decision pressed into the room. Finally, the order came, quiet but firm. "We'll task the pilots. Observation only. If it's out there, let's put eyes on it." The silence lingered. On the Nimitz, word filtered into the ready room, where aviators gathered before their flights. The air smelled faintly of coffee and machine oil, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. Pilots leaned back in chairs, arms crossed, helmets at their feet. Some flipped through notes, others joked half-heartedly. But when the briefing officer spoke, the room stilled. Unidentified aerial contacts, confirmed by radar over multiple days. Objects show capabilities beyond known aircraft. Today, flights will include visual intercept attempts. Do not engage. Observe and report. The words landed heavily. Some pilots smirked, dismissing the notion as ghosts on the scope. Others raised eyebrows, silent but attentive. For seasoned aviators, radar anomalies were nothing new. Yet the persistence, night after night, log after log, made this different. Commander David Fravor listened closely. With thousands of flight hours behind him, he trusted instinct as much as instruments. An instinct told him this was no error. He noted the calm authority in the officer's tone, the lack of speculation, the precision of the language. This was not a briefing born of curiosity. It was born of necessity. The Pacific remembers. On deck, the sea breeze carried the mingled scents of salt and fuel. Jets were towed into position, crewmen waving with glowing wands. Catapults hissed, steam rising into the air. The steel of the deck vibrated with the hum of engines warming for launch. To anyone watching from afar, it was routine, the endless choreography of a carrier strike group at work. But beneath the rhythm, anticipation built, pilots strapped in with more than drills on their minds. The reports of the radar room, the murmurs in the ready room, all added weight to the moment. For the first time, the unknown was not confined to glowing screens or carefully worded logs. It was a mission. Inside the radar room, operators watched as new contacts flared across their scopes. They tracked them carefully, voices steady over headsets, their data feeding the pilots above. Each sweep felt like a pulse, each blip like a heartbeat echoing through steel and sea. The stage was set. Observation had become pursuit. The mystery that lived in silence was about to meet human eyes. The Pacific remembers, the silence lingers, and the sky waited. Chapter 3. The pilots encounter engines thundered across the deck of the Nimitz, their sound vibrating through the steel plates and up into the bones of every crewman standing watch. The air was thick with jet fuel and salt, the smell sharp and metallic, carried on a breeze that swept across the open Pacific. Crew in brightly colored jerseys moved with choreographed precision, guiding aircraft into position, arms raised in practiced signals. Commander David Fravor walked with helmet in hand, visor reflecting the morning light. His wingman followed, boots striking steel in the same steady rhythm. They had heard the briefing, its calm words stripped of speculation, yet heavy with implication. Unidentified aerial contacts. Observe and report. Routine pressed forward, but routine now carried an edge. Fravor strapped in, the cockpit closing around him like a familiar second skin. The seat's harnesses tightened, oxygen hissed through his mask, and avionics hummed to life. Dials glowed in soft green and amber, their warmth pressing against the cool flow of air from the vents. The jet was alive beneath him, power building with every second. The catapult officer signaled. Steam hissed, cables locked. Fravor steadied his breathing, hands resting firm on the stick and throttle. Then came the jolt, the violent push of acceleration as the catapult released, hurling the jet forward in an instant. The deck vanished behind him, and the horizon opened wide. The Pacific spread endless and calm, sunlight shimmering across its surface. Clouds hung in faint wisps, the sky a pale canvas. His wingman lifted off behind him, the two jets climbing together, engines carving white scars across the blue. Radio chatter was calm, clipped, precise. Controllers aboard the Princeton guided them toward coordinates where anomalies had last appeared. Contact bearing 270 altitude variable, came the steady voice. Proceed to intercept. Fravor acknowledged, his eyes scanning the horizon. The cockpit was filled with sound. The roar of engines, the soft buzz of instruments, the hiss of oxygen. Yet beneath it all, silence pressed in, the kind of silence that carried expectation. Minutes passed as they closed the distance. Then below, the ocean revealed something strange. Against the smooth expanse of blue, a patch of water churned violently, foam spreading outward in rings as though something massive had broken the surface and slipped away. The disturbance looked fresh, the waves boiling against the calm around them. Above that patch hovered the object. Fravor's eyes narrowed behind his visor. White, oblong, smooth, it hung motionless at first, just above the roiling water, its presence sharp against the sea's endless horizon. No wings, no rotors, no tail, no exhaust plume to betray propulsion. Just a silent form, 40 feet in length, hovering with intent. He keyed his radio. Visual contact. Object over disturbance. No control surfaces. No plume. His wingman confirmed, steady and calm, though the silence between words spoke louder than the report itself. The Pacific remembers. Fravor angled his jet into descent, circling toward the object. His wingman mirrored the maneuver, both jets spiraling lower. The sunlight caught the canopy, flashing across glass and steel. The disturbance below churned steadily, foam spreading wide. The object remained above it, patient, almost expectant. It moved suddenly, darting left, then right, then holding still again. Each shift was instantaneous, deliberate, not the arcs of momentum known to pilots, but sharp translations, as if inertia had no claim over it. Fravor's training steadied him. His hands were firm, his voice calm, but his mind registered the strangeness. Decades of flying had taught him the language of aircraft, and this spoke none of it. The Pacific remembers. The silence lingers, and the encounter had begun. The two jets spiraled lower, sun glinting off their canopies, the Pacific stretching vast and reflective beneath them. Commander David Fravor kept his eyes locked on the object above the boiling patch of sea. It did not flee. It hovered, still and silent, as if acknowledging their approach. His wingman mirrored his descent, the two aircraft circling in measured arcs. Every instrument hummed within the cockpit, altimeter ticking, oxygen hissing, the vibration of engines pressing through the seat and into his spine. But all of it faded beneath the singular focus of what hung ahead. The object moved. One moment it was perfectly still. The next it darted left, then right, its shifts instantaneous. No turn radius, no arc of acceleration. It was there, then elsewhere. Fravor felt his instincts protest. Jets did not move like this. Helicopters wavered. Drones adjusted incrementally, but nothing in his experience leapt so cleanly through space. He keyed the radio. His voice was calm, but the words carried weight. Object maneuvering erratically. No visible control surfaces. No exhaust. Copy came the even reply from the Princeton. Maintain intercept. Report. Visual. The Pacific remembers. Fravor tightened his spiral, banking hard. G-forces pressed into his chest, straps biting against his shoulders. His jet groaned faintly under strain, every control surface working to hold the turn. Yet the Tic Tac moved without effort, shifting position as though inertia were meaningless. Closer now, its surface revealed nothing new. Smooth, featureless, no seams, no markings, no intakes. Sunlight slid across it in pale reflections. It was as if it had been carved from the air itself, complete in its simplicity. Fravor angled to cut across its position. He wanted to close the gap, to pass through its airspace, to see it from within a breath's distance. But the Tic Tac responded instantly. It tilted, not like a jet banking, but as though the entire object had simply changed orientation in a blink. Then it accelerated, a blur so sudden it left his senses scrambling to follow. Contact repositioned. Fravor reported, voice clipped, holding opposite. His wingman confirmed, tone flat, but edged, visual, range unchanged. It was as though the Tic Tac anticipated their every move, mirroring them with a precision no pilot could match. Each time they pressed closer, it countered, not aggressively, but with a strange grace, always holding the space between them. The Pacific remembers. The silence lingered. Fravor pushed lower, intent on breaking the pattern. He felt the jet strain, vibrations tightening through the frame. Sweat pricked against his temples, cooled quickly by the steady hiss of air from his mask. His body was heavy under the pull of gravity, yet his mind remained sharp, locked on the silent dance unfolding in the sky. The object darted again, sideways in a flash. His instruments barely caught the shift before it stabilized once more, floating as though nothing had happened. It was playfully evasive, impossibly calm, always beyond reach. In the space between heartbeats, Fravor realized this was no chase. It was a conversation written in motion. His jet spoke in turns and dives. The Tic Tac answered in impossibilities. Neither touched the other, but the dialogue was undeniable. And then, suddenly, the dialogue ended. The Tic Tac accelerated. Not in build-up, not in transition. In a single instant, it blurred across the horizon and vanished. One frame it was there, steady in his sights. The next, the sky was empty. Fravor's breathing steadied, his hands firm on the stick. He scanned, eyes darting across sea and sky, but there was nothing. The horizon stretched clean, unbroken. The ocean below glimmered, its disturbance already softening into ordinary waves. His wingman's voice crackled across the radio, calm, clipped, but betraying awe beneath. No tally. Contact lost. The Pacific remembers. The silence lingered, and the mystery only deepened. The horizon stretched vast and empty. Commander David Fravor steadied his jet, his eyes sweeping across the endless sky. His wingman flew tight on his flank, both aircraft circling where the object had been. But there was nothing. No glimmer of light, no blur of motion, only the wide Pacific below, its earlier disturbance dissolving into calm waves that glistened in the sun. The silence pressed in. The roar of engines and hiss of oxygen still filled the cockpit, but against the absence of the Tic Tac, they seemed strangely muted. Fravor keyed his radio, his tone calm, disciplined. Contact lost. No visual. From the Princeton, the controller's voice returned, steady but edged with focus. Copy. Stand by. Tracking new contact. Fravor's gaze swept again across the horizon. He exchanged a glance with his wingman through the glare of their canopies. Both men knew they had seen something extraordinary, something that played by rules outside their training. Jets were creatures of physics and limits. This object had moved like thought itself. The Pacific remembers. In the radar room of the Princeton, operators leaned closer to their screens. The contact had reappeared, not near but miles away, precisely at a waypoint where the pilots had been ordered to fly next. Their voices stayed clipped, calm. Contact reacquired, bearing 270, 20 miles. Another confirmed, strong return. Holding steady, supervisors exchanged silent looks. This was no random reemergence. It was intentional placement. The Tic Tac had not simply fled. It had chosen where to appear. The silence lingered. Back in the cockpit, Fravor adjusted his heading, listening as the controller relayed coordinates. But even before he could close, the object blinked from the scope again. A sweep later, it was back, now at a different point, again aligned with their projected path. It was as though the Tic Tac was not just aware of them, but ahead of them, waiting in places they had not yet reached. Fravor steadied his breathing, keeping his voice even. Object appears predictive. Radar indicates repositioning at waypoints. His wingman confirmed, words measured, but the edge beneath could not be hidden. The Pacific remembers. Minutes stretched. The jets circled, their fuel gauges slowly ticking lower. No further visual contact was made. Each sweep of the radar teased them with another sudden reappearance, only for the blip to vanish again. The anomaly was not gone, only playing in distances beyond pursuit. Eventually, controllers gave the order to return to the carrier. Fuel reserves demanded pragmatism. Jets could not chase ghosts forever. Fravor acknowledged, banking toward the Nimitz. His wingman matched the turn, both aircraft gliding back across the glittering expanse. Touchdown brought them back to the world of steel and steam. Hooks caught cables, wheels screeched against deck, and the thunder of engines slowed into silence. Crewmen rushed to secure the jets, guiding them into position. From the outside, it looked like routine. Another flight, another landing, but inside the cockpits, the memory lingered heavy. In the ready room, helmets were set down on tables, flight suits unzipped, voices calm but firm as they debriefed. Fravor spoke in measured detail, the size, the shape, the absence of wings or exhaust, the sudden darting movements, the acceleration that defied inertia, the boiling patch of sea below. His wingman added confirmation, steady and precise. Others in the room listened, some skeptical, others quietly attentive, but the weight of the words hung in the air. These were not rumors. These were reports from trusted aviators. Meanwhile, in the radar room, operators logged final entries. The Tic Tac had reappeared yet again after the jets departed, holding steady for moments before vanishing altogether. The logs were filed. The data was preserved. The silence remained. The Pacific remembers. The radar remembers. And now the pilots remembered too. The first intercept was over, but the mystery was only beginning. Chapter 4. Thermal Shadows. The human eye can be deceived. Distance bends perception. Light plays tricks. The vastness of sky can make even seasoned aviators question what they see. But machines tell their stories differently. Where eyes grow weary, sensors remain alert. Where memory bends, the recording lens preserves. Beneath the fuselage of the jet, a quiet witness waited, the FLIR pod, forward-looking infrared. A cylinder of lenses and gyroscopes, humming faintly, locked to the movements of sky and sea. Its purpose was simple yet profound, to see in heat what human vision could not. Inside the cockpit, the pilot nudged a control. The screen flickered, painting the world in shades of black and white. Warm objects glowed pale. Cold ones receded into darkness. The ocean appeared as an endless sheet of near black, its surface cool and indifferent. The horizon blended into sky, a thin boundary of shadow, and above this quiet canvas, a shape appeared, small, white, smooth. It glided without plume or trail, bright against the cool ocean beneath it. The mechanical eye followed, crosshairs centering, systems locking with a faint electronic chirp. The object drifted, hovered, darted, then steadied again. No heat plume betrayed engines. No flicker revealed combustion. In the world of infrared, propulsion usually painted clear signatures. This one carried none. The Pacific remembers. The pilot's voice entered the recording. Calm but taut. Target acquired. No exhaust. His words were clipped, professional, but even in their brevity, awe bled through. The FLIR pod adjusted continuously, gimbals spinning, stabilizers compensating for every buffeting of wind, every vibration of the jet. Through it all, the object held, locked inside the gaze of the machine. It moved with a precision that mocked the crosshairs, slipping left, then right, then climbing steadily. Each shift forced the sensors to chase. Each chase ended in reacquisition, the lock holding once more. On the screen, the object appeared simple, just an oblong blur of brightness against the dark. To an untrained viewer, it might have looked unimpressive. a smudge of light, grainy and small, but to those who understood, it was extraordinary. The absence of heat was itself a signature. The abrupt accelerations, the sharp translations, the smoothness of its form, all of it told a story in the language of light. In the space between heartbeats, the machine bore witness. Later, in briefing rooms aboard the carrier, pilots and analysts would replay the footage frame by frame. They would measure distances, estimate speeds, argue over angles. But in the cockpit, in the moment, the reality was simpler. The camera had seen what the human eye alone might have doubted. It had captured presence without explanation. The silence lingered. As the jet leveled, the object shifted again, not with hesitation, but with abrupt certainty, as though it had chosen its next position. The crosshairs slid, the system blinked, then locked once more. A faint beep marked reacquisition. On the screen, the oblong shape remained steady, indifferent to the pursuit. The Pacific remembers, and so did the machine. For the crew watching in real time, the FLIR display carried weight beyond the ordinary. This was not speculation whispered on a deck. This was not a fleeting spark, mistaken for a star. This was data, preserved in pixels and frames, unblinking and undeniable. The encounter had left human hearts racing, had filled cockpits with disbelief, but now it had also left a record. Silent, impartial, in black and white. The Pacific remembers. The silence lingers, and the mechanical eye would not forget. In the hours after the encounter, the jets returned to the carrier, engines cooling, flight suits unzipped, helmets set aside. Pilots walked the familiar corridors of the Nimitz, but carried with them a weight unlike routine fatigue. They had seen something that words could barely hold, yet they knew their words alone would not be enough. Down in intelligence spaces, the FLIR pod's recording was transferred and queued for review. A small group gathered around the display. The room smelled faintly of paper, coffee, and warmed electronics. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a flat brightness over the scene. In the corner, the playback system came to life, screen flickering into the monochrome palette of infrared. The Pacific appeared black, cool, and endless. Then, above it, a shape glowed white, small but distinct. The officers leaned closer. A faint electronic chirp marked lock. Crosshairs steadied. The object hovered, then darted to the left, sliding across the screen with unnatural ease. No plume, no trail, only the pale brightness of its body. The silence in the room deepened. To the untrained eye, the footage may have seemed ordinary, a blurry shape in grainy black and white, moving against a dark background. But those in the room knew what they were watching. They knew the expected signatures of jets and missiles. They knew the bright flare of engines, the spreading glow of exhaust. This had none. The Pacific remembers. The footage replayed. One officer muttered, "Where's the heat?" Another shook his head, noting how smoothly the lock tracked, despite the object's abrupt shifts. The pod's gyros compensated faithfully, but the object's movements forced constant corrections. At one moment, it hovered steady. At the next, it zipped, so sudden that the system struggled to keep pace. The clip looped again. Each viewing revealed new strangeness. The absence of drag, the way the object seemed to choose its movements rather than obey momentum, the silence of it all. No roar, no vibration, only the language of light etched across the screen. The silence lingered. Pilots who had seen the Tic Tac with their own eyes leaned forward, confirming with quiet nods. This was what they had chased. The screen had caught what their memories carried. The smooth white oval, featureless yet alive with intent. Some in the room remained cautious. They asked if the pod could have malfunctioned, if glare or sensor error could produce such an image. Technicians checked diagnostics. The system was sound. Others wondered if it was a drone, some classified technology unknown even to them. But no drone they knew could plunge from the edge of space to sea level in seconds, nor hover without heat signature. The Pacific remembers. In those moments, the footage became more than a recording. It became proof, not proof of what the object was, but proof that it existed, no longer confined to fleeting glances or fading radar blips. The encounter now lived in frames and pixels, and proof carries weight. The tape was logged, labeled, and secured. Copies were distributed to higher channels. Analysts began drafting their own notes, their language precise but careful. Words like anomalous, unidentified, and unexplained appeared. None dared name more than the evidence allowed. For the sailors and pilots, the footage circulated in whispers. In break rooms and mess halls, a few described what they had seen on the screen. Some dismissed it as odd but inconsequential. Others lowered their voices, leaning close, eyes wide. For those who had flown against the Tic Tac, the recording was both vindication and burden. It confirmed what they knew, but it also ensured the memory would never fade. The Pacific remembers, the camera remembers, and now so would the record. The FLIR footage did not stay confined to the ready room. Within hours, copies were carried on secure drives, passed hand to hand under the hum of fluorescent lights, delivered into spaces where doors were locked and access required clearance. What had begun as a blur on a screen in a jet now entered the quiet bureaucracy of classification. The room where the analysts gathered was unremarkable. Long table, pale walls, the persistent smell of brewed coffee and recycled air. Screens glowed with paused frames of the object, crosshairs centered on its oblong shape. The video looped again and again, each viewing accompanied by murmurs, not exclamations. Analysts rarely shouted. Their disbelief expressed itself in silence, in the way they leaned closer to screens, in the long pauses between their clipped remarks. Movement inconsistent, thermal signature absent, system diagnostics clean. Each phrase was logged in notes, lines of text that stripped the footage of awe. In the language of intelligence, wonder became anomaly. Impossibility became inconsistent with known performance. The Pacific remembers. One analyst traced a finger along the screen. See how it holds altitude, then translates sideways instantly. That's not aerodynamic. There's no lift involved. Another replied, if it's propulsion, it's nothing we recognize. A third remained silent, eyes narrowing as he watched the tic-tac dart across the frame, vanish, then return. The footage was real. The debate was what it meant. Draft reports began to circulate. Each described the same facts. Object size estimated at 40 feet, smooth and featureless, no visible control surfaces, no heat plume, movements beyond known craft. Each recommended further study, though none offered explanation. Words were chosen carefully, as though too much speculation could taint the evidence itself. The silence lingered. For the pilots, the footage was vindication. Their words had been captured by the camera's mechanical eye, confirmed by frames replayed in briefing rooms. Yet with vindication came new unease. What they had seen with their eyes was now preserved in a way no denial could erase. The object was real. The mystery no longer lived only in memory. Among sailors, the footage became a rumor, mentioned in mess halls and whispered during late watches. They caught it on tape. Someone would say, lowering his voice, "It's not just stories now." A companion might scoff, but silence often followed, heavy and uneasy. The Pacific remembers. Above the level of rumor, the footage was marked, classified, and filed. It joined other records, some recent, some decades old, forming part of a larger puzzle hidden within filing cabinets and secure servers. To most, it vanished into silence. But for those who had watched it firsthand, its absence in daily conversation only amplified its presence in thought. In intelligence summaries, the Tic Tac became a line item, part of a pattern, yet also unique in clarity. The radar logs supported it. The pilot testimonies matched it. The FLIR pod had preserved it. Evidence had accumulated across different instruments, different perspectives, all pointing to the same conclusion. Something had been there. The silence lingered, but it was a silence filled with weight. In the years to come, the footage would travel further, leaving the confines of classification to appear in briefings, on television, across the internet. Analysts would dissect its frames, skeptics would question its interpretation, and believers would point to it as proof. But in those first days, aboard ship and in quiet rooms ashore, it was not a matter of belief, it was a matter of record. The Pacific remembers, the machine remembers, and now the files remembered too. Chapter 5: The Weight of Testimony. When the jets returned to the carrier, the encounter did not end. It followed the pilots into the ready room, into the soft fluorescent glow, where helmets rested on tables and flight suits hung damp with sweat. The air smelled faintly of coffee, machine oil, and the salt carried in on boots. Voices were low, calm, but edged with the weight of what had just transpired. Commander David Fravor sat at the front, speaking in the same clipped tones he had always used in debriefings. His words were steady, his eyes clear, but those who listened felt the gravity beneath them. He described the object as he had seen it: smooth, oblong, 40 feet long, no wings, no exhaust. He described the movements: instantaneous, deliberate, impossible. He described the boiling patch of sea, the way the object seemed to react to their presence as though aware of the intercept. His wingman confirmed each detail, voice even, manner restrained. Together their testimony carried weight. Pilots with reputations, earned through years of precision and calm, did not exaggerate. Their words were trusted currency. The Pacific remembers. Others in the room listened. Expressions varied. Some leaned forward, brows furrowed in concentration. Others sat back, arms crossed, skeptical but silent. The Navy was a world of discipline, of data and procedure. To speak of something outside those boundaries risked more than disbelief. It risked reputation. The debriefing officer took notes, pen scratching softly across paper. He asked questions in neutral tones. Altitudes, ranges, angles of movement. Each answer was precise, stripped of speculation. The official record would show no awe, only observations. But in the room, all lingered like a quiet fog. Afterward, the pilots dispersed. Some returned to quarters, peeling away flight gear. Others lingered in small groups, conversations hushed. A few dared to whisper words unsuited for official reports. alien, impossible, otherworldly, but most chose silence, knowing that to speculate aloud was to invite dismissal. The silence lingered. In corridors, sailors asked questions. Did you see it? What was it? The pilots answered carefully, their tones steady. Unidentified contact. No known explanation. The words were safe, but they carried a shadow of the extraordinary. On the Princeton, radar operators gave their own accounts. They described what they had tracked: objects dropping from 80,000 feet, hovering near the sea, then vanishing. Their logs were precise, their language neutral, but their eyes betrayed the weight of the memory. For them, the Tic Tac was not just a blip, it was a presence. The Pacific remembers. In quiet corners, over late-night coffee, or in hushed conversations on deck, the operators shared more openly. One admitted, "It's like it was toying with us." Another said, "It moved like nothing I've ever seen." Their words were whispers, carried away by the wind, never entering the official record. To testify was to risk ridicule. The Navy prized professionalism. Pilots who spoke too freely of extraordinary encounters risked being labeled unreliable, even unstable. Operators who wrote too much into their reports risked questions about their judgment. The safest path was silence. Yet silence carried its own burden, and so they spoke carefully, enough to be truthful, enough to be precise, but never enough to cross into speculation. Their courage was not loud, it was quiet, measured, steady. The Pacific remembers, the silence lingers, and the burden of testimony had only just begun. The words of pilots and radar operators did not stay in the ready rooms and consoles where they were first spoken. They moved upward, folded into official reports, carried into the language of command. On the Nimitz and the Princeton, the chain of communication was as disciplined as the turning of screws in steel. Testimony traveled from sailor to supervisor, from supervisor to officer, from officer to command. Each step trimmed the language further. What began as awe in a cockpit or a radar room became clipped sentences on paper. Oblong object, no visible control surfaces. Rapid descent, 80,000 feet to 200 feet. Lateral acceleration inconsistent with known aircraft. The extraordinary was reduced to neutral observations, as if neutrality could strip it of its strangeness. Yet the weight remained. The officers who read the reports studied them carefully. They were not men easily swayed by exaggeration, nor by the excitement of younger sailors. They knew their crews, knew their disciplines. If multiple radar operators confirmed the same anomalies, if seasoned aviators gave aligned accounts, then the reports carried credibility. Still, skepticism was reflex. In the Navy, unusual claims demanded unusual scrutiny. Some officers muttered about instrument errors, about quirks in the FLIR1 radar. Others suggested foreign drones, experimental craft, perhaps even tests unknown to the very men tasked with observation. Silence usually followed such suggestions, not agreement, but the absence of better alternatives. The Pacific remembers. One officer leaned over the table during a review, the glow of a monitor casting shadows across his face. "Even if it is a drone," he said quietly, "that means someone has capabilities we can't match, and that may be just as extraordinary." His words hung in the air, unchallenged. Up the chain, the language grew colder, more precise. Reports described unidentified aerial contacts and observed anomalous performance. Each paragraph carried dates, times, altitudes. Nowhere did they carry the awe of sailors staring into a night sky or the pulse of adrenaline in a cockpit. That awe was shed like clothing, left behind so that only the bare facts could move higher. The silence lingered. For the men who had given testimony, the risk was personal. Pilots knew their reputations were their lifeblood. To be seen as unreliable was to invite questions about fitness to fly. Radar operators, too, knew how quickly credibility could erode if others thought their imaginations had strayed into their work. Speaking the truth of what they had seen was a duty, but it was also a gamble. In hushed conversations, some admitted their fears. What if this follows me and my record? What if they decide I imagined it? Others reassured them, reminding each other that honesty was the only defense. They had written what was real. They had said what they saw. That was enough. The Pacific remembers. And still the testimonies climbed. From shipboard reports, they moved into regional commands, folded into larger intelligence summaries. At each stage, more layers of language wrapped around them, cushioning the raw testimony inside phrasing, designed to neither alarm nor dismiss. The reports became like the sea itself, calm on the surface, carrying hidden depths. Those who had spoken could only wait, uncertain of how their words would be received. Would they be dismissed as errors, filed away and forgotten? Or would someone somewhere hear the weight behind the clipped sentences and recognize them for what they were? Silence was the answer they received, at least at first. The silence of bureaucracy, the silence of higher commands that rarely spoke back down the chain unless orders were needed. For the pilots and operators, life aboard resumed. Watches were kept. Flights were launched. Reports were written on other matters. But beneath it all, the weight endured. They had spoken. They had testified. And though the words may have been stripped of awe, the memory itself could not be stripped. It lingered, steady and undeniable, waiting to be remembered. The Pacific remembers. The silence lingers, and the testimony was now part of history, whether or not anyone chose to believe. For those who had seen the Tic Tac with their own eyes, and for those who had tracked it through the mechanical gaze of radar, testimony did not end with reports. The words written on paper, the neutral phrases entered into logs, were only part of the story. The rest lived in silence, carried in hearts and minds as a burden not easily shared. In bunks, sailors lay awake long after watches ended, listening to the hum of ventilation and the endless push of the sea against the hull. Some stared into the darkness above their racks, replaying in memory the strange blips that had dropped and hovered. Others thought of the pilots describing the white, oblong craft above a boiling patch of sea. The mind reached for explanations, but none held, and so the images repeated themselves, night after night, until fatigue finally carried them into restless dreams. The Pacific remembers. In the ready rooms, conversations slipped between routine chatter and sudden silences. Pilots spoke of maneuvers, of fuel loads, of training runs. Yet sometimes a pause fell, and someone mentioned the object. Voices dropped lower then, eyes shifting as though wary of unseen listeners. Some dismissed it quickly, steering back to safer topics. Others leaned in, their tones soft, carrying both curiosity and caution. Camaraderie helped soften the edge. Those who had shared the experience could exchange a glance, a nod, a brief remark that spoke volumes without elaboration. In that glance was the knowledge that they were not alone. Others had seen it too, felt it too, carried it too. In the rigid world of discipline and duty, such unspoken solidarity mattered. Still, the burden was heavy. A pilot confided quietly to a friend, "You know how many things I've chased up there? I can explain them all, Except this. His companion only nodded, offering no answer, because none could be given. On deck, during late watches, sailors looked up at the stars differently now. The constellations still arched in brilliance across the sky, but among them lingered the possibility of something else, something that moved with intent, yet without sound. For some, the sight of a shooting star triggered a fleeting thought. What if it's not a meteor? For others, the hum of the horizon carried a question that could not be silenced. What if it returns? The silence lingered. Testimony changed those who gave it, not in ways visible to commanders, but in subtler ways that lived in posture, in tone, in the careful choice of words. Some grew more cautious, unwilling to speak freely about what they had seen. Others grew more thoughtful, carrying a sense of wonder that softened even their hardest edges. A few withdrew into themselves, keeping the memory private, locked away where doubt could not reach it. The Pacific remembers. In rare moments of solitude, some allowed themselves to feel awe without restraint. Standing alone on deck, staring into the horizon at dusk, a sailor might whisper to the wind, "What are you?" No one would hear but the sea itself. The answer never came, but the act of asking brought a strange comfort. For those who had testified officially, the burden was doubled. Their names were attached to reports that now lived within files, filed away in drawers or on servers. They had spoken their truth, but in speaking it, they had also risked their reputations. They knew that their words might be questioned, their experiences doubted, and yet they had chosen honesty over silence. That choice carried weight, a quiet courage, rarely recognized, seldom rewarded, but real. The Pacific remembers. The silence lingers, and those who had spoken carried their burden into the future, not knowing who would believe them, but knowing that their truth had been set down. For memory carries what instruments cannot measure, and memory once spoken endures. Chapter 6. The Paper Trail. The ocean kept its silence, but the Navy could not. Reports do not dissolve like waves on the surface. They travel, folded into folders, filed in drawers, carried upward until they reach rooms far from the sea. The Tic Tac encounter followed this course, moving from the steel decks of ships into the fluorescent-lit offices of higher command. It began with summaries typed in neutral fonts, paragraphs built from the careful words of pilots and radar operators. Their awe had already been stripped in earlier drafts. What remained were numbers, ranges, altitudes, speeds, unidentified aerial contact observed. Object exhibited performance inconsistent with known aircraft. A string of times and bearings stood where wonder had once lived. The Pacific remembers. These reports left the carrier strike group as packets of data, carried along secure channels to commands ashore. Officers who had never smelled the salt spray of the Nimitz's deck, who had never felt the tremor of catapults launching jets into sky, now rid of objects that moved without inertia. Their desks were stacked with other matters: training schedules, logistics, operations overseas. The extraordinary arrived among the ordinary, another file among many. Still, the language caught their eyes. No heat signatures, rapid descents, hovering at sea level, movements beyond known performance. The words were calm, but the implications were not. Meetings followed, small and quiet. Screens flickered in windowless rooms, replaying the FLIR footage on loops. Analysts leaned forward, pens tapping against notepads. They paused frames, tracing the oblong shape, noting its lack of wings or exhaust. They scribbled notes in shorthand, no plume instantaneous Excel. Thermal anomaly. The silence lingered. Some questioned the equipment. Could the SP-1 radar have misread? Could the FLIR pod have glitched? Diagnostics were checked and checked again. The systems were sound. The data held. Others suggested adversary technology, perhaps some secret development unknown even to the Navy itself. But those explanations strained under the weight of the details. No drone plunged from space to sea in seconds. No aircraft hovered without heat. The Pacific remembers. Draft assessments began to circulate. They did not speculate beyond what evidence allowed. Their language was careful, almost sterile. Observed object demonstrates flight characteristics not consistent with known systems. Further study recommended. Behind the restraint was an unspoken truth. The data described something extraordinary, but no one wished to write the word aloud. For those who had been at sea, the reports were distant echoes. Life aboard the Nimitz resumed its rhythm. Flights launched, watches turned, sailors cleaned brass, polished decks, and carried on. But somewhere beyond their horizon, their testimony lived in files now marked with classification stamps, their words reduced to sterile lines of text. And in that transformation, the burden shifted, no longer carried only by sailors and pilots. The mystery now rested within the halls of bureaucracy, where decisions were made not by awe but by process. The Pacific remembers. The paper remembers. In time, the Tic Tac would join a larger archive, other reports, other sightings, files gathered across years and theaters, each describing anomalies that resisted dismissal. The Nimitz encounter was only one thread, but it was a strong one, supported by radar, by testimony, by film. It became part of a tapestry woven in silence, a history stored in drawers. The ocean may hold mysteries in its depths, but institutions hold them in files, and those files rarely speak until they are asked to. The Pacific remembers. The silence lingers, and the paper trail had only just begun. In Washington, files do not echo with the sound of the sea. They sit quietly in drawers and on servers, their weight measured not in water displaced, but in pages stamped and cataloged. It was into this world that the Tic Tac encounter eventually drifted, carried by secure channels into a program few knew by name. The Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, AATP. On paper, a modest project within the Department of Defense, its budget small compared to sprawling weapons systems and global operations. Yet its task was vast, to examine what official language called anomalous aerial threats. Behind that phrase lay decades of whispers, sightings, and reports, all bound together by the same silence. The Nimitz case entered the archive like a stone dropped into a deep pool. It did not splash loudly. It sank, joining others, its ripples spreading quietly among analysts who had learned to work in shadows. The Pacific remembers. In windowless offices, the FLIR's footage played again and again on government-issued monitors. Analysts leaned closer, their pens scratching notes in careful shorthand. Acceleration instantaneous, thermal signature absent, object size estimated 40 feet. Their remarks were calm, but their silences spoke of unease. The radar logs were reviewed, drops from 80,000 feet to sea level, lateral movements faster than known craft, hovering without plume. Each entry cross-checked with pilot testimony, each line confirming another. The data fit together too cleanly to dismiss. The silence lingered. ATP analysts had seen patterns before, reports from pilots and other theaters, objects pacing aircraft, then vanishing, lights above forests and deserts, blips on radar that mocked the laws of motion. But the Nimitz case carried weight beyond rumor. It had multiple witnesses. It had radar confirmation. It had video. It was, in their language, high fidelity. Some speculated quietly, was it advanced technology from an adversary nation? If so, it represented a leap decades ahead of known capabilities. Was it a classified program, hidden even from them? If so, it was the most closely guarded secret imaginable. Others let silence stand, or speculation would only unravel further. The Pacific remembers. Reports were drafted in the same careful tone that marked all such work. Unidentified aerial phenomena observed, performance inconsistent with known systems. Recommendations for further study were made, though resources were limited. ATP was not a sprawling agency, it was a handful of people, a budget measured in the millions against programs funded in the billions. Their work relied on persistence, not power. The Tic Tac file joined others in drawers, already heavy with strangeness. Rendlesham, Iran, 1976. Incidents over the Atlantic. Stories from submarines in the deep. The Nimitz was not an outlier. It was part of a continuum, another thread in a tapestry woven quietly over decades. The silence lingered. Back at sea, sailors who had filed the reports moved on. Duty shifted to other operations. For them, the encounter became memory, retold in quiet corners, remembered in glances shared with those who had also seen. But for the analysts in Washington, the Tic Tac lived still, not in memory, but in frames and figures, in charts and transcripts, preserved as evidence that something extraordinary had crossed Navy airspace. In those halls, the extraordinary was never spoken of as extraordinary. It was written down as anomaly, phenomenon, inconsistency, but no matter the label, the truth remained. The object had been real, and it had been beyond them. The Pacific remembers, the paper remembers, and within ATP, the mystery endured. Once catalogued, the Nimitz encounter vanished into the machinery of classification. Files were stamped, logged, and placed within systems designed less for discovery than for containment. The encounter that had filled cockpits with awe and radar rooms with whispers now lived behind clearance levels and acronyms, its reality acknowledged only in silence. The Pacific remembers. For the sailors and pilots, life moved forward. Missions continued. Deployments shifted. New orders came. The Tic Tac became memory. A story murmured on decks or over coffee, always in tones careful not to draw too much attention. But within AATP, the encounter remained alive in files and footage, replayed in offices where blinds were always drawn. The FLIR video looped on government monitors. Analysts paused frames, measuring angles, timing accelerations. The radar logs were reviewed alongside transcripts of pilot testimony. Each element corroborated the others. It was not imagination, not a single instrument's error. It was a convergence of evidence. And yet, the convergence brought no clarity. Some suggested adversary technology, but the leaps in performance, acceleration, control without plume, predictive maneuvers, strained credibility. Others wondered if it was a classified US program, but those who had seen many secrets before shook their heads. No one hides capabilities by flaunting them before carrier strike groups. The silence lingered, so the encounter was filed as unexplained, not solved, not dismissed, but sealed. It joined the quiet chorus of other cases in AATP's drawers, echoes from Iran in 1976, whispers from Rendlesham, reports from submarines in the depths. Each described something extraordinary. Each was labeled anomaly, then tucked into shadows. Years passed. The Pacific rolled on, waves erasing footprints of memory from the shore, but never erasing what instruments had once recorded. Pilots retired. Sailors moved on to other ships, but the file remained, gathering dust not in neglect, but in caution. Then, quietly, the walls shifted. In 2017, after years of silence, news broke. The New York Times revealed the existence of AATP, along with 3 declassified videos. One was the Tic Tac, the FLIR1 footage that had once glowed only in classified rooms, now flickered across television screens and computer monitors around the world. The video was the same, a small white blur, tracked in crosshairs, darting with impossible speed. To those who had lived it, the release was surreal. What had once been whispered in mess halls was now dissected in headlines. For the first time, the Pacific's memory became public memory. The silence lingered, but it had changed shape. Analysts debated the footage on news programs. Skeptics called it glare, misinterpretation, censor error. Believers pointed to its consistency with testimony and radar. Pilots who had chased the Tic Tac spoke openly at last, their words now shielded, not by secrecy, but by the fact that the footage itself had been released. For the Pentagon, statements were careful. The videos were real, they confirmed, but the objects remained unidentified. Nothing more, no conclusions, no names, just the calm repetition of unidentified aerial phenomena. The Pacific remembers, the paper remembers, and now the world remembered too. Chapter 7: Patterns Across Time. The Tic Tac encounter was not the first mystery to drift across military logs, nor would it be the last. It joined a lineage, a chorus of anomalies that stretched back decades, perhaps centuries, each separated by time and place, but bound by the same silence. The Pacific remembers, but so too does the desert, the forest, the sky itself. In 1947, a rancher outside Roswell, New Mexico, found debris scattered across his land. Thin metal that bent and returned, fragments marked with strange symbols. The official story changed quickly. First flying disc, then weather balloon. The desert wind carried whispers faster than reports could be rewritten. What truly fell remained unanswered, but the memory endured. 3 decades later, in 1980, lights appeared in a forest outside the twin bases of RAF Woodbridge and Bentwaters in England. American airmen reported a glowing craft nestled among the trees, its surface etched with markings. Some touched it, feeling heat radiating through their gloves. Their commanders listened, their testimonies recorded. Yet the official explanations, lighthouse beams, misinterpretations, never erased what the witnesses carried. The Rendlesham Forest case became Britain's Roswell, a thread of mystery, woven far from the desert, but in the same fabric. The Pacific remembers. The forest remembers. The desert remembers. During the Cold War, radar operators in bunkers across Europe and North America spoke in hushed tones of fast-moving blips that streaked across their scopes, vanishing before interceptors could scramble. Submarine crews whispered of lights beneath the waves, silent companions moving with impossible precision. Commercial pilots recounted objects pacing their flights, darting away when approached. Each story alone might have been dismissed. An error, a trick of light, a glitch in equipment, but together they formed a pattern. The silence lingered. When analysts reviewed the FLIR1 footage, many privately admitted they had seen its echoes before. The abrupt accelerations, the absence of exhaust, the hovering presence, all familiar motifs. The tic-tac was not unique. It was another verse in a song that had been playing quietly for decades. A researcher within AATP once described it as a geometry of impossibility, the same shapes, the same motions, repeated across different places and times. Saucers in the 1950s, triangles in the 1980s, tic-tacs in the 2000s. Each new form carried the same defiance of physics, the same quiet disregard for human expectation. The Pacific remembers, and so does time. Patterns across decades suggested not accident, but persistence. Something, whatever it was, had been watching, visiting, passing through. The names changed, the witnesses changed, but the essence remained. For the pilots of the Nimitz, this realization added weight to their own memories. They had not stumbled into an isolated anomaly. They had joined a lineage of witnesses, farmers, soldiers, airmen, sailors, civilians, each carrying the burden of describing the indescribable. In the space between heartbeats, across generations, the silence endured. The Pacific remembers, the desert remembers, the forest remembers, the sky remembers, and the pattern continued. The Cold War was a time defined by vigilance. Eyes scanned skies, not only for weather and stars, but for threats that could cross oceans in minutes. In radar rooms buried beneath concrete, in command posts perched on icy coasts, operators watched sweeping lines trace arcs across glowing screens. Most nights, the returns were predictable. Bombers tracked on training flights, satellites moving in steady orbits, the faint clutter of weather systems drifting like clouds across a digital sea. But there were nights when the screens told a different story. There were nights when the screens told a different story. Operators spoke later, often quietly, of blips that streaked across scopes at impossible speeds. Objects that appeared suddenly at one edge of the screen, only to vanish before the sweep could return. Targets that hovered where no aircraft could, then shot skyward, gone in an instant. Their voices were calm when they spoke of it, but their eyes carried unease. The silence lingered. Reports surfaced in both East and West. In the Soviet Union, fighter pilots scrambled after luminous objects that defied pursuit. In the United States, interceptors were launched only to return empty-handed, their pilots describing craft that accelerated beyond their reach. In Canada and Britain, radar operators logged anomalies that moved against wind and weather, their signatures sharp and undeniable. Each case alone might have been dismissed as equipment malfunction, but the pattern repeated too often, across too many borders. The Pacific remembers, the Atlantic remembers. In 1976, over Tehran, Iranian pilots reported a glowing object that disrupted their systems, shutting down instruments when they approached. One pilot attempted to fire missiles, only to find his weapons panel unresponsive. When he broke off pursuit, the systems returned. His testimony matched ground radar returns, confirmed by civilian witnesses who watched lights dance across the night sky. The echoes carried forward. In the 1980s and 1990s, air traffic controllers spoke of triangles, vast, silent shapes that drifted across radar, sometimes pacing commercial flights. Civilian pilots described lights that arranged themselves in perfect formations, then vanished as if swallowed by the dark. Military crews aboard submarines whispered of objects beneath the waves, moving faster than any known vessel, their presence felt in sonar echoes that defied explanation. The silence lingered. By the time the Tic Tac was captured on FLIR in 2004, the framework of mystery was already decades deep. Analysts who studied the footage did so with an unspoken awareness. This was not new. This was not isolated. This was another page in a book already thick with anomalies. The object's movements matched motifs seen before: abrupt acceleration, hovering without plume, vanishing and reappearing at predicted points. Even its shape, simple and featureless, echoed earlier accounts of smooth, seamless craft. The Tic Tac was unique in clarity, but not in essence. The Pacific remembers, in small offices where analysts gathered, someone would sometimes gesture toward the FLIR screen and mutter, "We've seen this before." They meant not the specific object, but the pattern, the geometry of impossibility, repeated again and again across generations and geographies. For the sailors and pilots of the Nimitz, that awareness brought a strange comfort. They were not alone in what they had witnessed. Others had seen, others had spoken, others had carried the same weight of disbelief, wrapped in certainty. And so, the Tic Tac joined the continuum, not the first, not the last, but another verse in the same long song. The Pacific remembers, the silence lingers, and the pattern stretched onward, from Cold War shadows to modern skies. A decade after the Tic Tac danced above the Pacific, another set of encounters unfolded on the opposite side of the continent. This time, it was the Atlantic, the waters east of Virginia and the Carolinas, where Navy pilots flew training missions almost daily. Their jets sliced through humid skies, engines echoing over waves, radar systems sweeping ceaselessly as part of routine. Yet in 2015, routine fractured. Pilots began reporting objects in restricted airspace, not once, but repeatedly. Small, spherical shapes with cubes suspended inside, glinting faintly in the sun. They appeared at altitudes where commercial airliners flew, sometimes stationary against the wind, sometimes darting with abrupt movements that mocked inertia. Unlike the Tic Tac, these were not solitary apparitions. They showed up day after day, week after week, their presence persistent enough to feel almost ordinary. The silence lingered. One pilot later recalled nearly colliding with one of the objects. "It passed right between us," he said, voice steady but edged with the disbelief that never truly faded. His training demanded calm, but his words carried weight. Another spoke of seeing them on radar before confirming them visually. Each account matched the others, a consistency that mirrored the Nimitz experience years before. The Atlantic remembers. Radar operators along the East Coast logged the contacts as they appeared, their signatures sharp and undeniable. Drones were suggested, but their persistence, altitude, and speed made that explanation hollow. No known drone hovered in high winds for hours. No known drone darted with such sudden precision. And if they were drones, no one could answer the question, whose? The parallels to the Tic Tac were clear. Abrupt acceleration, absence of plume, movements beyond known craft, anomalous objects entering controlled military airspace without explanation. The Pacific and the Atlantic now shared the same silence. As news of these encounters filtered upward, the burden of testimony repeated itself. Pilots filed careful reports, language stripped of speculation. Unidentified aerial phenomena observed, object cube in sphere, altitude 30,000 feet, behavior inconsistent with known systems. The extraordinary was again reduced to neutral lines, but the awe lingered in the voices that carried them. The Pacific remembers. The Atlantic remembers. By the late 2010s, the pattern could no longer be dismissed as isolated anomalies. Encounters spanned decades, theaters, generations of pilots. The shapes changed: discs, triangles, tic tacs, spheres, but the essence endured. They hovered, they darted, they appeared where they should not be, moved how they should not move, and vanished without trace. The silence lingered. For the public, the release of the Tic Tac footage in 2017 opened the door. The East Coast encounters soon followed into headlines, confirmed by Pentagon statements that carefully avoided conclusions. Words like unidentified and phenomena carried the same careful neutrality as Navy reports. Officials did not name what the objects were, only what they were not. Not drones, not aircraft easily explained, not illusions. For the sailors and pilots who had lived the experiences, the acknowledgement carried both relief and unease. Relief that their testimonies had been validated, no longer confined to whispers. Unease because the mystery had only deepened. More encounters meant more questions, not answers. The Pacific remembers. The Atlantic remembers. The sky remembers. And the pattern stretched onward, refusing to fade, persisting in every generation that looked upward and saw movement where none should be. Chapter 8. The echo in memory. The Pacific was calm again, its surface broken only by swells rolling in long, patient arcs. To anyone standing on the deck of a ship, the ocean looked as it always had, endless, indifferent, carrying the same rhythm it had carried for centuries. Yet for those who remembered the tic-tac, the sea was no longer just water and sky. It was a stage where something extraordinary had once appeared, leaving behind no trace but memory. The Pacific remembers. Years had passed since the encounter, yet its echoes lingered. Pilots who had flown into that sky still recalled the sudden dart of a featureless white shape. Radar operators still remembered the blips that defied inertia, dropping from space to sea in seconds. Analysts still studied the FLIR footage, frame by frame, each pause a reminder that the mystery endured. Memory does not fade as quickly as waves. It carries what instruments cannot measure: the scent of salt in a cockpit, the hum of avionics, the way silence fell after the object vanished. For those who had been there, these details remained as sharp as the moment they occurred. The silence lingers. The Pacific has always been a place of mystery. Long before radar and jets, sailors spoke of lights over the horizon, of strange movements in the night sky, of companions unseen but felt. The ocean was too vast to control, too deep to know. It carried not only ships but stories, whispered from deck to deck, generation to generation. The tic-tac encounter was new in technology, but old in essence. Another story etched into the sea's memory. Standing on deck at dusk, one could feel it still. The horizon glowed faintly as the sun dipped low, painting the waves in copper and gold. The first stars pierced the sky, their reflections trembling on the water's surface. Sailors leaned on rails, quiet after long days, their eyes drawn to constellations. For them, the sky was no longer empty. It had been marked, forever changed by what had once moved across it. The Pacific remembers. In ready rooms and corridors, the story lived on in fragments. A pilot would mention it casually, then fall silent. An operator would nod, a small acknowledgement between those who shared the memory. Words were scarce, but the bond was strong. To have seen was to carry, and to carry was to be changed. Even for those who had only read the reports or seen the footage, the encounter left an impression. Analysts replayed the video not out of belief or disbelief, but out of respect for what data could not resolve. They spoke in neutral tones: anomaly, unexplained, inconsistent. But beneath the neutrality was recognition. Something had been there. The silence lingered. The Pacific does not reveal its secrets quickly. Its depths hold wrecks centuries old. Its waves erase footprints within moments. What passes above it leaves no lasting trace but memory. Yet memory endures, passed along quietly, a thread woven into the fabric of human curiosity. And so the Tic Tac remained, not as wreckage, not as debris, but as testimony. A radar track, a voice on a headset, a shape caught in infrared, a story whispered on deck. Together they formed an echo, soft but insistent, carried across years. The Pacific remembers, the silence lingers, and memory once spoken does not fade. Memory has a way of expanding beyond its origin. What begins in the solitude of a cockpit or the dim light of a radar room eventually spills outward, moving through corridors, into offices, and sometimes into history itself. The Tic Tac encounter followed this arc, from silence to whispers to cautious acknowledgement. On the decks of the Nimitz, memory first lived in quiet glances. A pilot who had seen the white object dart across the horizon would meet the eyes of a radar operator who had tracked its impossible descent. No words were needed. The shared recognition was enough. Memory bound them, like two sailors who had seen the same wave rise out of darkness. But silence could not hold forever. Reports carried the encounter upward, stripped of awe, yet preserving its facts. In those neutral sentences, object accelerated instantaneously, no heat signature observed. Memory shifted into institutional form. What individuals had felt as wonder, the Navy recorded as anomaly. The silence lingered. At first, the files remained sealed. Classification pressed down like the weight of the sea, holding memory still. But within the Pentagon, within a tip, the Tic Tac became part of a continuum. Analysts replayed the footage in dim offices, their pens scratching notes that framed the extraordinary in bureaucratic restraint. UAP, they called it, unidentified aerial phenomenon, a term wide enough to hold the impossible without naming it. The Pacific remembers. Years passed. The encounter lived in whispers among sailors who had moved to new ships, pilots who had retired, analysts who had shifted assignments. The memory never left them, though it often went unspoken. Then, in 2017, the silence broke. The footage was released. The story entered headlines, and what had once been confined to secure rooms flickered on televisions across the world. For the first time, the Pacific's memory became public memory. The silence lingered still, but it was different now. It was no longer the silence of secrecy, but the silence of awe. Millions watching the same blurry white shape in crosshairs, millions wondering what it meant. The Tic Tac, once a private burden, had become a collective question. Pilots stepped forward, their voices steady, their testimonies calm. They spoke not to prove, but simply to say what they had seen. Fravor described the object's darting dance, its instantaneous acceleration. Radar operators confirmed the blips that dropped from 80,000 feet to sea level in seconds. Each voice was measured, each word chosen carefully. They did not claim to know, they only claimed to remember. The Pacific remembers, and so does the world. Public debates followed. Analysts on television speculated, some pointing to foreign technology, others to natural misinterpretation, still others daring to ask if it was something more. Skeptics dismissed, believers affirmed, but through it all the footage itself remained, silent, undeniable, unchanging. Memory had moved from ship to shore, from classified file to public discourse, and yet at every level, it carried the same weight, presence without explanation. The silence lingered. For those who had been there in 2004, watching their story unfold across screens was surreal. What had once been whispered on steel decks was now spoken aloud by anchors in polished studios. What had once lived in their private memory had become part of a global conversation. And yet, even with all the words, all the speculation, the essence remained the same. The object had appeared. It had moved with impossibility. It had vanished. Nothing had changed in the facts themselves. Only the audience had grown. The Pacific remembers. The people remember. And memory itself became a witness. Mysteries do not fade. When explanations fail, they linger, shaping thought, guiding questions, becoming part of the unseen fabric that connects generations. The Tic Tac encounter was such a mystery, not solved, not dismissed, but carried, first by the sailors and pilots who lived it, then by the institutions that recorded it, and finally by the world that watched its blurred image flicker across a screen. The Pacific remembers. Memory, like the sea, carries more than it reveals. Beneath its surface live fragments of wonder. The first glimpse of a white oblong hovering above a boiling patch of water. The sudden acceleration that left even seasoned pilots breathless. The faint chirp of the FLIR lock, holding steady on something featureless and impossible. These fragments do not vanish. They settle into the quiet places of the mind, surfacing in solitude, carried into dreams. The silence lingers. What does it mean for humanity to hold such memories? For centuries, sailors spoke of lights above waves, of companions unseen but felt. Farmers told of objects in fields, soldiers of shapes that moved across their skies. Each account added to a chorus of strangeness, each echo reinforcing the pattern. The Tic Tac joined this lineage, not as an isolated anomaly, but as another verse in a song older than nations. For the witnesses, the burden was both heavy and wondrous. To testify meant risking doubt, yet also honoring truth. To remain silent meant safety, yet also isolation. The courage to speak, even in clipped phrases on official reports, became an act of quiet integrity. Memory carried forward because someone chose to share it. The Pacific remembers, and so do those who listen. For institutions, the encounter raised other questions. How do governments hold mysteries that defy their frameworks? To label them unidentified is to admit incompleteness. To dismiss them is to risk ignorance. The files that contain such events are both archives and mirrors, reflecting not only what was seen, but what we cannot yet explain. The silence lingers, and for the world, for those who read the headlines, who watched the footage, who listened to voices steady with testimony, the Tic Tac became more than a case. It became a reminder that mystery still lives among us. In an age of satellites and sensors, of global communication and endless data, something still slipped through, unclaimed by explanation, untamed by certainty. That reminder carries a strange comfort. To know that the universe is not exhausted, that wonder has not been used up, is to feel both small and expansive. Small because we are not its measure, expansive because we are still its witnesses. The Pacific remembers, the silence lingers, and memory endures. Long after the reports are filed, long after the footage is debated, long after skeptics and believers exhaust their arguments. The encounter will remain, not as proof, not as conclusion, but as presence. It will live in the quiet words of those who saw it, in the recordings of instruments, in the echo of stories told beside the sea. And perhaps that is enough. To remember is to honor mystery, to carry it forward into the spaces where certainty cannot go. To remember is to keep alive the possibility that the sky still holds secrets, and that humanity still has questions worth asking. The Pacific remembers, the sky remembers, and so must we. Night has a way of softening the edges of memory. The hum of the day quiets, and the mind drifts to what lingers just beyond explanation. The Tic Tac encounter. The FLIR1 mystery is one of those lingering threads. It begins as a record of jets and radars, of steel decks and glowing screens. But it ends, as so many stories do, in silence and reflection. The Pacific remembers. The sailors and pilots who lived it carry fragments of that day like stones in a pocket. The cool air rushing into a cockpit, the sudden dart of a featureless white shape, the patch of ocean roiling beneath it, the sharpness of a radar blip, vanishing and returning miles away. These fragments do not fade, even when years stretch between the moment and the telling. Memory carries what instruments cannot measure. Institutions, too, remember. Their language is colder, precise, stripped of awe, unidentified aerial phenomena, performance inconsistent with known systems. Yet behind the restraint, behind the stamped files and secure drawers, lies the same unanswered question. Something was there, something moved across the sky, indifferent to the limits of our understanding. The silence lingers, and now the world remembers. The FLI red footage, once confined to classified rooms, now drifts across countless screens. People pause in quiet living rooms, in late-night offices, watching the same small white blur dance against the crosshairs. They ask the same questions whispered on carrier decks years before. What was it? Where did it come from? Why did it move as it did? Answers remain elusive, but perhaps answers are not the point. Perhaps the gift lies not in certainty, but in the persistence of wonder. The Pacific remembers, the desert remembers, the forest remembers, the skies above us all remember. Each generation inherits its mysteries. Lights in the night sky, objects darting across radar, shapes that move with intent but without explanation. To carry these mysteries is not a burden alone. It is also a reminder that the world is not yet finished, that the map of knowledge still has blank spaces, that the sky above us remains alive with possibility. In the quiet moments before sleep, it is comforting to know that mystery endures, that even in an age of satellites and data streams, of sensors and surveillance, something still slips through, untouched, unclaimed, a reminder that the universe is larger than our grasp. The silence lingers. Close your eyes now. Imagine the hum of the carrier, steady as a heartbeat, the soft glow of radar screens sweeping in arcs, the hiss of oxygen in a pilot's mask, the vast ocean stretching outward, silver under moonlight. Somewhere above it all a shape moves, smooth, silent, unmarked, vanishing and returning as if carried on a rhythm older than time. The Pacific remembers. Let the rhythm carry you. Let the waves roll gently beneath you. Let the memory of the sky, infinite and starlit, guide you into rest. You do not need answers tonight, only the comfort of knowing that mystery is still with us, that wonder has not yet been spent, that silence itself can be a companion. The silence lingers, the sky is not empty, and in the space between heartbeats, sleep waits,